Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, how US President Donald Trump's overhaul of the US tax system could spark an international trade war. Also this week, electric cars, why the road to zero emissions may be built on illegal cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Plus, when is a taxi not a taxi? How resolving Uber's identity crisis has implications for the gig economy. 2017, if nothing else, was the year when boring old taxation became a hot topic. We had the release of the Panama Papers, followed by the Paradise Papers, which showed us how the world's wealthiest hid their money from revenue collectors. And then this week, billionaire US President Donald Trump rewrote tax law for the world's biggest economy and some of the world's biggest companies. Trump and Republicans say his tax bill will pour rocket fuel into the engine of the US economy, spurring growth and creating jobs. Democrats say the bill is mostly a boon to businesses and the rich. Kimberly Halkett reports.
With nearly every Republican lawmaker at his side, Donald Trump did not pass up his chance to enjoy his first legislative victory after almost a year in office.
It's always a lot of fun when you win.
The passage of the most dramatic changes to the U.S. tax code in 30 years.
I always say the most massive, but it's the largest tax cut in the history of our country. And reform, but tax cut.
The tax reforms are controversial. Big cuts to corporate tax rates from 35 to 21%. Democrats say will benefit the wealthy at the expense of ordinary Americans.
It's a Ponzi scheme. The tax cuts aren't going to be meaningful for working families and everyday Americans, and the jobs will never materialize.
Republicans argue the cuts will make the United States more competitive with countries like China, with similarly low corporate tax rates. It's hoped this will encourage companies to do business in the U.S. and bring back jobs, a key Trump campaign promise. But while this legislation is about reforming taxes, it is also about winning. Donald Trump failed to deliver on a campaign promise to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, or what many Americans call Obamacare. It's a frustration Donald Trump has lamented for months. But passing the tax legislation now allows Trump to claim victory on both. Tucked inside the tax reforms is a repeal of an Obamacare requirement called the individual mandate that forced all Americans to buy health insurance or pay a tax fine. The legislation still must go through legal review and may not be signed into law until the new year. The president says Americans will start to see tax relief as early as February.
The GOP tax scam is a monumental con job.
But many Americans remain skeptical. Most members of Congress did not have time to read the hundreds of pages of changes to the hastily passed tax legislation.
Thank you very much, everybody.
And according to most polls, 2/3 of Americans are doubtful the tax changes will have any positive impact on their lives.
It's a big win for Republicans, of course. They insist Americans will learn to love the bill when they see their paychecks in the new year. Despite Trump calling it a gift to the middle class, many economists say one of the major winners here is corporate America. Tax for big business is cut from 35% currently to 21% indefinitely. And tax breaks for individuals and families, on the other hand, expire after a decade. Because the president hasn't released his tax returns, we don't know exactly how it will impact his businesses. And there's another big unknown. Republicans acknowledge nobody knows if the sweeping $1.5 billion tax bill will produce enough growth to pay for itself. Instead, economists worry it could accelerate the growth of the national debt and lead to benefit cuts down the line. Well, joining me from New York is James Henry. James is a Global Justice Senior Fellow with Yale University. Good to have you with us. So last week, we know the finance ministers of the top 5 EU economies wrote a letter to the US Trade Secretary, and they were concerned. They were saying the US tax reform bill, as it was proposed a week ago, might contravene global fair taxation rules. Now, looking at the bill as it has been passed, is that in fact the case?
I think it may well be. The ministers are referring to the fact that the United States, like many other OECD countries, is a signatory to tax treaties, and has also signed up for frameworks that committed to a system of rules. In this case, this latest tax bill, which was just rammed through Congress, contains measures that penalize some kinds of transactions internationally that are just totally outside the scope of those rules. And I think they have a legitimate concern. I think my concern is more general, which is that this is going to set off, as it already is doing in this letter, an enormous amount of international tax competition. We're going to have countries fighting with each other and competing for lower and lower tax rates.
What you're really talking about now is more related to investment and trade, and the ministers are worried that this is going to start a trade war, will it?
Especially harmful to developing countries like, let's say, Argentina. They have a 35% corporate tax rate. Under the current law, U.S. companies are able to credit the taxes they pay in Argentina for business activities there against their U.S. taxes. Under this bill, essentially, there'll be no offshore taxes to credit, that they can credit against. And so Argentina is an example of a country like, countries like Korea, Mexico, much of Latin America, South Africa, that are going to wake up and find that there's enormous pressure on the part of, the corporate community to cut their taxes. So this is going to have enormous feedback effects. It's by no means clear that the financial projections that supported this bill are going to hold up. We'll have larger deficits, less economic growth on the margin than was predicted.
So, do you agree with those economists who say ultimately this is just going to increase the income of corporations? It's not going to have that effect where it actually trickles down to other classes?
Well, it depends on what they do. Part of it, the story depends on what they do with the repatriated $2.6 trillion.
Right. I think the supporters of the bill say it's going to turn into capital expenditure and investment and so on and so forth and create jobs, and we all live happily ever after.
The last time we tried this in 2004 under President George W. Bush, there were no jobs created. The companies basically took the money and used it mainly for shareholder buybacks. And here again, we see, trillions of dollars basically being allowed tax-free back in the U.S. with no conditions. There's no requirement that they invest in jobs or plant and equipment in the United States. It's unconditional. So that is a major fault in this bill, even apart from all the others. But what I'm pointing to is the fact that as the United States now signs up for this territorial tax with essentially very low taxes on its foreign corporate activities, companies like Apple and Google and Microsoft, they're benefiting from this one-time kind of tax heist. But longer term, the question is, will they continue to invest here when they can still continue to save money offshore?
Do we have any idea for sure how this will benefit the Trump organization?
Well, in many ways. One immediate benefit, the only reason, for example, we know that President Trump paid any taxes at all in the one tax year that we have a return for, which, we actually have 2 pages of his 500-page return from 2005. And that showed that a provision called the alternative minimum tax was responsible for him not being able to pay as low as 5% on his income that year. So, the repeal of that.
But his comeback, I guess, on that, he's been saying that he's actually closing loopholes which he has benefited from in the past.
Oh, that's nonsense. He's benefiting from the estate tax repeal here, basically the estate tax not being repealed, but the exemption is being doubled. The alternative minimum tax is worth something like $637 billion of income, of tax revenue loss that is going directly to the top 1%. So people who would otherwise not pay any taxes because of loopholes And he's one of the key beneficiaries of that. He's also a beneficiary of the so-called pass-through rules that are very favorable to the kind of rents and royalties that he receives in income. So, that's just, he needs to read his own bill. On balance, I think it's, amounts to one of the largest transfers of public wealth to a tiny elite in U.S. history.
With global implications too. Thanks so much, James, for your analysis on that.
Quite welcome.
Still to come on Counting the Cost.
I'm Wayne Hay in the Vietnamese capital Hanoi, where we'll tell you why motorbikes could soon be disappearing from the city streets.
Is it a taxi or is it an Uber? It sounds like a philosophical question, but that's exactly what the European Union's top court had to rule on this week. And its verdict: Uber should be classified as a transport service and regulated like other taxi operators. Well, that landmark ruling resolving Uber's identity crisis also has implications for the gig economy. Nev Barker reports from London.
It's a landmark judgment with big implications for other online companies. The European Court of Justice ruled that Uber is a taxi service and not a technology firm, as the company insists. It means Uber will now have to comply to the same regulation as other transport firms, rules that can be set at country level. The long-running court case was first brought by taxi drivers in Spain, where the backlash against Uber has been explosive. Thousands of taxi drivers took to the streets accusing the company of unfair competition. There were similar scenes in several other cities. This was Paris, and this demonstration brought central London to a standstill. And in Lebanon, Uber's been under mounting scrutiny after a driver with previous criminal convictions allegedly murdered a British embassy worker this month. Here in London, Uber had its licence revoked back in September for breaching operating rules, including its handling of alleged sex attacks. Still, there are 3.5 million Uber users here, and many were angry with that decision. Part of the company's enduring appeal is that it's efficient and cheap, much cheaper than traditional black cabs. For now, it's been allowed to continue operating in the capital while it appeals the decision. The European Court's ruling isn't legally binding, but it does send a message to other high-tech firms. Uber's one of several companies facing legal battles in recent years. Airbnb, another San Francisco-based firm, allows people to rent out their homes to visitors. But cities such as Barcelona and Berlin want to regulate usage to avoid driving up rents and forcing out locals. Experts say it's important to uphold regulation without stifling innovation.
If you look at many of the new tech firms, yes, they have a new way of delivering things, but the main reason they're making money is often by getting around rules, tax, regulation, the kind of things that the average companies have to apply with.
The digital revolution's advancing at breakneck speed. Now the law needs to pick up the pace.
Now, one of the big changes facing the global transportation industry is electrification. Big corporations and car manufacturers are going electric and ditching the combustion engine. Well, just this week, Toyota said it will have an electrified or hybrid version of all vehicles by 2025. But Amnesty International has shone a light on the dark side of this revolution. Cobalt is one of the key ingredients added in electric batteries. And if we talk about cobalt, we have to talk about the Democratic Republic of Congo, the world's leading source of the compound. Now, Amnesty says children as young as 7 work in dangerous conditions in DRC cobalt mines. The DRC could benefit from electric cars the same way Saudi Arabia did from oil. However, mining is pretty much unregulated there, and the country continues to struggle with corruption and warlords. Well, joining me from Sydney is Gavin Went. Gavin is the founding director and senior resource analyst at Australia-based Mine Life. Good to have you with us. So there's a lot to talk about. So let's focus, if we could, on one material like cobalt. How much regulation is there of ethical issues when it comes to the mining of this important material that's necessary in the manufacturing of electric cars?
Well, at the present time, you'd have to say that there isn't a lot of regulation around the mining of cobalt. You have to understand that about half of the world's current cobalt reserves are located within the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Africa, the DRC, and they account for about 54% of the cobalt that's mined each year internationally. And at the present time, the industry over there is not very well regulated. You could probably say that a lot of the cobalt that's mined is generated from illegally operated mines that employ almost slave labor, if you like, underage workers, illiterate workers, workers that don't get paid very much money. We should put it that way. And they're controlled by warlords, and the industry is appallingly run. Now, the balance of the production that comes out of the DRC is controlled by the Chinese, and the DRC government would very much like more of that cobalt to be upgraded in the country, processed. But at the present time, a lot of that cobalt is simply exported back to China for further value adding. So it's a very precarious situation to have so much production coming out of one of the poorest, least well-governed countries in the world
That's
today.
a bit shocking, Gavin. To what extent are car manufacturers aware of that? Explain to us how the actual supply chain works.
Well, very much so. So car manufacturers are dependent on, at least car manufacturers that are looking at going down the electric vehicle route. They are looking to source batteries from a specialist producer. So, for example, someone like a Panasonic or whatever it might be. Now, currently, a group like Tesla, the average battery that's used in their vehicles currently weighs about 85 kilograms. About 8 kilograms of that is comprised of cobalt. And the forecasts are that we're probably going to need about 3 times as much cobalt as is currently mined in the world within about 2 decades to satisfy electric vehicle demand worldwide. Now, vehicle manufacturers like Volkswagen, one of the biggest manufacturers in the world, is very keen to not only source cobalt, but they've publicly stated that one of their major priorities is to source ethically derived cobalt. So that means that they are looking outside of the DRC to try and source their cobalt, places like North America, places like Australia, for example.
So if we want to make the supply chain ethical, is the only way to do that to look outside of the DRC, or is there a way to make the supply chain globally ethical? I mean, what have we learned about the whole controversy over blood diamonds and diamonds mined in some of the conflict places you've been talking about?
You probably have to say that we haven't learned a lot. But certainly in the case of vehicle manufacturers, they have a reputation to protect, particularly some of the larger manufacturers, such as Volkswagen, such as Toyota, that have been involved in scandals, of course, internationally over recent times. We're seeing more and more consumer pressure. We're seeing more and more sociological pressure from society to ensure that that these commodities are ethically sourced. Now, given the estimated growth in cobalt demand, I think we're looking at something like about 9,000% growth in demand over the next 2 decades. A very big issue is going to be where this cobalt will come from, and hence companies are looking to source cobalt outside of the DRC as much as possible in order to ensure that this material is produced ethically.
If we're going to see that sort of demand explode, as you're sort of painting the picture there, are we going to see an even more chronic shortage of cobalt supplies in the world market? And what does that ultimately mean for the future of electric cars?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the major drawbacks for electric cars at the present time is the sourcing of the 4 key materials that are involved in their manufacture. We're looking at things like lithium and graphite and cobalt, for example, some of the key materials. And because of the prices of those key materials have been rising so quickly, in order to make electric vehicles economic for purchasers, governments have had to step in and subsidise them to this point. Now, that's not something that governments are going to want to do in perpetuity. So what we need to see is the cost of energy production come down. And there have been estimates that have suggested that currently we're looking at about $430 per kilowatt hour. That's the current cost. There are forecasts that over the next 10 years, that's going to come down to somewhere around about $100 per kilowatt hour. Now, I think that's a key figure, because at around about $100 per kilowatt hour, in my view, that's where electric vehicles start to make sense. Consumers can start to buy with confidence, knowing that the costs are reasonable. But until you reach that point, it's a major stumbling block. And so, the essence of what we're talking about here is the commodities themselves have to come down in price. That automatically means that more needs to be found. But in the case of cobalt, of course, we're talking about potential substitution. And I think that's another aspect that we could look at, actually reducing the amount of cobalt that's actually currently consumed in these typical batteries.
Well, it's been great talking to you. Thanks so much for that, Gavin.
Thank you. A pleasure.
And finally, in many cities, motorbikes are seen as part of the solution to traffic congestion rather than the problem. But the bike boom in Vietnam means more than 5 million of them clog the capital. Now, the government's applying the brakes with a ban on motorbikes. It aims to reduce traffic jams and pollution, as Wayne Hay reports from Hanoi.
Vietnam's road to economic success is becoming clogged. One of the costs of the communist government's embrace of capitalism is traffic congestion. The narrow streets of Hanoi can't cope with the influx of cars and motorbikes. So government leaders in the capital have decided that after a gradual phase-out, motorbikes will be completely banned from the city centre by 2030. It'll be a major change for Vietnamese so reliant on two-wheeled transport.
Our culture, actually, I think it's kind of inconvenient. Yeah, firstly, that's the first thing I think about.
In Vietnam, using motorbikes is like a tradition for people, but I think traffic is getting worse. So if the government does this, I think it will be good to reduce traffic jams.
Even some who have benefited from the motorbike boom think a change won't be so bad.
The number of bikes coming here to be repaired may go down, but it won't affect me too much because maybe I can focus on quality rather than quantity.
As recently as the late 90s, the roads were significantly quieter. More people rode push bikes, which is something today's government also wants to revive. And this is a big part of the motivation. A construction boom combined with the increase in vehicles has resulted in falling air quality. The fact the government is even considering this law is perhaps a sign that Vietnam is becoming a victim of its own success. It has one of the best performing economies in the world, and while there are still big problems with poverty, wages are rising, and with that comes an increase in purchasing power. But not everyone can afford a car, and if they could, then the congestion and pollution problems would get a lot worse. So if the government's plan is to work, public transport will need to play a big part. But construction of a rail network in the capital has ground to a halt because of funding problems. Experts say all forms of public transport will have to be overhauled.
The government needs to prepare thoroughly to guarantee the policy can be implemented. For example, the public bus system needs to be improved to meet increased demand before the new law can be introduced.
City leaders in Hanoi have already done the easy part by passing the law. Now the hard work begins to try to put it in practice and free up the city's streets.
And that's our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.